Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this video is about Kant's reading. It's a critique of pure reason. So this is the third fundamental question that we've been going over, and the question is, what can I know? So Kant is unique among philosophers because he's trying to bridge the gap between the empiricists and the rationalists, and we'll see that in the discussion questions. So Hume came before Kant, and Kant was responding to Hume, and Hume said that he was responding to Isaac Newton's discoveries of these mathematical laws of physics, and Hume was saying, we have not discovered these eternal absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. That's what rationalists believe in, that reason is the ability to use these absolute ideas that Plato talked about, imprinted on the soul. Plato's example was the idea of absolute equality. We saw that in the Phaedo on page 38. He says this was from his argument that knowledge is recollection. He was trying to prove why the soul is eternal. It lives before the body was born, and it will live after. And his second proof was knowledge is recollection. And his theory went like this. Whenever we see two things that are almost perfectly equal, it makes us remember the idea of perfect equality. We could never have had that idea, or we could never have learned that idea in the material world, because no two things are ever perfectly equal here. So where did we come up with this standard by which to judge the relative equality of different things? We must have had it before we were born. There goes the theory. So if we had it before we were born, the soul existed before we were born. That was his half of his proof that the soul doesn't die. He combined that with his other proofs. Opposites come from opposites. So if life comes from death, death comes from life. Well, if death comes from life, which we know, then life must come from death. So at any rate, the point was the roots of rationalism. Do these absolute ideas, these standards by which we judge the relative values of everything we perceive in the material world, do those absolute concepts exist innately in the mind or soul? Or, as the empiricists will say, does knowledge come only from empirical sense perceptions, what you see, smell, hear, touch, and taste? And then later, with those memories, you play with them, and you relate those various memories of sense perceptions and come up with theories about the way the world works after observing it. That's empiricism. So Kant is trying to synthesize empiricism and rationalism. And it's a complicated reading, and this is an introductory course, and furthermore, it's a summer condensed class, so I'm realizing, reading through this, there's no way that you're going to be able to dedicate the amount of time required to really digest what Kant is talking about, so I'm going to give you as basic an overview as I can, and I can't, I'm not claiming to be any Kant expert either. I know the basics that I'll be grading you on, which is at least pertinent for our class, but if you feel like this is too much, well, remember, it's an introductory class, and I'm not expecting you to have a full grasp of this kind of very complicated thinking. So what I go over here in the video should be sufficient for our exam, and it's also part of a potential discussion question for discussion question 3. As a matter of fact, let me go back and read what that is going to be, so that in part 3 of our book, we read different theories about what a human can know. Which of the following philosophers provides a more convincing theory about the nature of human knowledge? Berkeley, Hume, or Kant? Why? Remember to use short, pertinent quotes to support your answer. So, does Berkeley, Hume, or Kant provide a more convincing theory about the nature of human knowledge? Berkeley was probably the easiest to understand. Hume the second easiest, and then Kant the more difficult one of those. So just keep in mind, this overview of Kant will help you on potential exam questions and on the discussion question, potentially, if you think his is the most convincing theory, which you might have reason to think that because it came after the other two and built upon them. So whatever shortcomings were exposed in Berkeley's and Hume's philosophies, Kant was trying to correct for them. So it's worth paying attention to what he said. It's pretty fascinating. It's also really, I think, the beginning of one school of psychology that's famous today, Jungian psychology, which believes in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. It's kind of what Kant is going to talk about. So very generally, before I get into these discussion questions, here's what Kant is going to say. He's going to say, okay, empiricists, I'll agree, all knowledge begins with sense impressions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only source of knowledge. Maybe our mind does have these built-in ideas that the rationalists talked about, these categories of thought, and he'll say, in fact, it does, space being one of them, and this is a tricky one. So if you ask an empiricist, you know, oh, all that's real is what I can touch and smell, etc. Well, what about space? I can't see space. I can't smell it, hear it, touch it, or taste it. Well, someone might say, well, here's my hands. Now look, right in between. There's space. You can see it. And then I'd say, well, I see one hand. I see another. I see in this video on the screen my face in between them. But the space itself, if I could see it, it would be something. It wouldn't be emptiness. Space is nothing. According to 20th century physics, space actually has qualities, but for our purposes here, you can't perceive space. Or time, for that matter. What does time smell like? How does it, what's the texture of it? So Kant will say, well, if you're an empiricist, you can't believe in the objective reality of space and time. Therefore, those are just ideas in the mind. Now that really throws a monkey wrench in materialism, because if you're saying, well, you know, and Berkeley was an empiricist, and he didn't believe in matter. He said, oh, what's this material object here? You can hear it clicking and everything. It's just an idea in my mind. How come it's so vivid, unlike the other ideas of my imagination? Because God creates this idea in my mind, and he creates it in everyone else's mind as well. So Kant isn't going to just assume the existence of God. Kant himself personally believed in God, but he did not think that reason could reveal the trustworthy reasons for believing in God. Reason constantly makes us think that we need to believe in God, or at least ask ourselves about God, he'll say, but it can't provide the answers. But the main point that Kant is pointing out is that there are innate ideas in the mind, but he won't say, and he won't go as far as Plato as to say that all of these absolute ideas are united in the absolute idea of the good or in God's mind. Kant will just say, we don't know. We have to see what these things are. But at any rate, we can analyze the nature of the human mind. What are the human categories of thought, and how do they make us perceive our sense impressions? So, with that, I'll start with these discussion questions and try to keep it as brief as I can. On page 335, discussion question 1, explain the distinction between pure and empirical knowledge. So that we'll go right to the beginning of the text. It won't be in this first paragraph, but it's necessary to give an overview of what Kant is going to say. So on page 321, the introduction of his critique of pure reason, he says, and the first section of the introduction is, of the difference between pure and empirical knowledge. So there's your discussion question 1. He says that all our knowledge begins with experience, and whenever he says experience, he means sense impressions, sense experience, smelling it or hearing it or tasting it, touching it, you know, all of the 5 senses. That all our knowledge begins with experience, there can be no doubt. For how is it possible that the faculty of cognition should be awakened into exercise, otherwise than by means of objects which affect our senses, and partly of themselves produce representations, partly rouse our powers of understanding into activity, to compare, to connect, or to separate these, and so to convert the raw material of our sensuous impressions into a knowledge of objects, which is called experience. This is a long question there. In respect to time, therefore, no knowledge of ours is antecedent to experience, but begins with it. So he's saying, yes, knowledge comes from sense impressions. But then his next paragraph, he says, but though all our knowledge begins with experience, it by no means follows that all arises out of experience. For, on the contrary, it is quite possible that our empirical knowledge is a compound of that which we receive through impressions and that which the faculty of cognition supplies from itself, sensuous impressions giving merely the occasion. In addition, which we cannot distinguish from the original element given by sense, till long practice has made us attentive to and skillful in separating it. So, the faculty of cognition. So there he says, we have sense impressions coming in, but then we have these faculties of cognition, these categories of thought that are transforming the raw material of sense impressions into the objects we perceive. The objects we perceive, like my famous mouse here, this is not necessarily something that exists outside of my mind. Sense impressions are coming in, but then they're being organized by my mind, which is an active partner in this knowledge, and creating this image of this object for my mind to perceive. What is this thing in itself outside of my perception of it? There's no way to know. I can only know it as I perceive it. So what are these categories of thought? What are these faculties of cognition? That's what he wants to find out. He wants to put a map, create a map of the different lenses through which our sense impressions are filtered. We have a lens of space. We have a lens of time. What other lenses could there be which transform the raw sense data into knowledge? What can I know? That's what he's trying to get into. So now, this is the second to last reading for this section of the book, so he's really getting to the details. What exactly is the difference between sense impressions coming in and the forming categories that I have, the absolute ideas? Well, he wouldn't say they're necessarily absolute as in the universal truths of God's mind, but at any rate, they're the truths that humans will perceive anywhere in the universe because our mind is imprinted with these, what he'll call a priori categories of thought before experience. A priori means before sense impressions. Okay, so continuing this discussion question was, what's the difference between pure and empirical? So empirical knowledge, we know what that is. So pure knowledge, he's saying, is just knowledge. If you look on page 322, the second full paragraph, he says, by the term knowledge a priori, therefore, we shall in the sequel understand not such as is independent of this or that kind of experience, but such as is absolutely so of all experience. Opposed to this is empirical knowledge, or that which is possible only a posteriori, that is, through experience, through sense impressions. Knowledge a priori is either pure or impure. Pure knowledge a priori is that with which no empirical element is mixed up. So there's your answer. Knowledge that has no empirical elements mixed within it. He'll go on to say, for example, the proposition every change has a cause is a proposition a priori, but impure because change is a conception that can only be derived from experience. So every change has a cause. So his idea of a cause, and this is why it starts to get really complicated, because he's saying, oh, it's a priori knowledge, but it's impure and pure. So at any rate, the short answer is pure knowledge a priori is that with which no empirical element is mixed up. Knowledge you can have without reference to any sense impression. And as always, that's complicated by his initial claim that all knowledge actually must begin with sense impressions. But once it wakes up these faculties of cognition, then we have these sources of knowledge within us that don't require sense impressions. So you see how confused I'm getting after reading this repeatedly. So these faculties of cognition, we wouldn't know them if they weren't activated by the incoming sense impressions. But after they have been activated, then we can analyze them for what they are themselves. So he says, and he's giving a few techniques. So this is kind of like yoga for the mind, what the Hindus would call jnana yoga. There's hatha yoga, or there's yoga of bending the body in different shapes. You know, touching your toes, that hurts. You're stretching your muscles in a way that you're not used to. Well, Kant is asking us to stretch our mind in ways that we're not used to. He wants us to turn consciousness in on itself and then analyze how our consciousness digests sense impressions and look for the, oh, I have a mind. That's just a vague and nebulous concept. What are the structures of the mind? Oh, that's a difficult question. How would I ever go about figuring that out? Well, he'll go into that in this next paragraph on page 322. Section 2, the human intellect, even in an unphilosophical state, is in possession of certain cognitions a priori. So he's saying, just the human mind naturally has certain ideas, like the rationalists would say. Before any experience, we are pre-programmed. So the question now is as to a criterion by which we may securely distinguish a pure from an empirical cognition. How will we know when we've come across one of these faculties of cognition? Experience, no doubt, teaches us that this or that object is constituted in such and such a manner, but not that it could not possibly exist otherwise. Now, in the first place, we have a proposition which contains the idea of necessity in its very conception. It is as if, moreover, it is not derived from any other proposition unless from one equally involving the idea of necessity. It is absolutely a priori. And then, instead of confusing you with this, necessity and strict universality at the bottom of the page therefore are infallible tests for distinguishing pure from empirical knowledge and are inseparably connected with each other. So if you can think of a concept, and if you cannot think of it not being true, if it would just be a contradiction, then it cannot be this pure a priori knowledge. We saw Hume talk about it too. He talked about relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas, he says, are just inventions of the human mind. And he said those are, for example, the truths of mathematics. You cannot imagine 2 + 2 not equaling 4. It would just be a contradiction. You'd just be speaking gibberish and you wouldn't be able to fool yourself, says Hume. So it's necessarily true. And not only is it necessarily true, it's strictly universal. Wherever you go in the universe and find any 2 things and add them to any other 2 things, you'll have 4 things. So if you make any claim that upon analyzing it in your mind, you realize it must necessarily be true. I can't even imagine it not being true everywhere in the universe. Then you have a priori, pure a priori knowledge. If you can imagine something not being, something being the opposite, then it's empirical knowledge. And Hume's example was, you can imagine the sun will not rise tomorrow. It'll just be dark. The sun won't come up. You can imagine the sun, the earth stops rotating and we're on the wrong side, sorry, and then no more sunrise. So it's possible to imagine it, therefore that cannot be pure a priori knowledge. So it's a nice little yogic mental trick to start to isolate those parts of our knowledge that are innate to our mind and those parts that we receive through sense impressions. That's what he's starting to do there. Okay, so there's so many pages and there's so many here. I'll just give you an example of how complicated this can start to get. I mean, here's just one of my torn up pages that's come out of the book, and you see all the circles and brackets and lines leading from here to there and notes, but it's, as I said at the beginning of this video, it's such a condensed class and this is such dense material that I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can. So let me just go to the second discussion question on page 335. Explain the analytic synthetic distinction. Okay, so here is another way for Kant to categorize the different forms of knowledge. What can I know? That's the question that's under consideration for part 3 of our book, and Kant is really getting into some details here. All right, on page 325, of the difference between analytical and synthetical judgments. In all judgments, wherein the relation of a subject to the predicate is cogitated, I mentioned it. All right, so subject and predicate, first of all. You have to understand basic English from 9th grade to start to understand what he's talking about. So the subject is what the sentence is about. You know, the dog walks fast. The predicate is explaining the subject, walks fast. So if the predicate is contained automatically in the definition of the subject, is there anything about the idea of a dog that includes the idea of walking fast? Not necessarily. There could be slow walking dogs, paralyzed dogs, so therefore it is not analytical. The claim that the dog walks fast cannot be understood just by analyzing the definition of a dog. It would be, therefore, what he calls synthetical. You're synthesizing two different conceptions, a dog and then walking fast. They don't necessarily belong together, so that's a synthetic judgment. An analytical judgment, for example, would be, an example that I've seen used a lot is all bachelors are male. That is an analytical judgment because the predicate, the subject is bachelors, all bachelors, and the predicate is are male. By definition, a bachelor is an unmarried male. Therefore, you don't need to actually ever go out in the world and meet bachelors to come to the conclusion that they are all male, because you just need to analyze the definition. So that is the distinction between analytical and synthetic judgments. And that becomes important for his entire map of the a priori categories of thought. And I've written one of these out, and I'll show it to you. So I'm hearing little noises back here, but I'm going to keep moving on. As a matter of fact, let me just show you this. So I wish I had a bigger whiteboard to work with or something. Here is Kant's 4 distinctions of knowledge. I'm looking at the screen here and I'm seeing what you can see. I might have to back it up a little bit. Okay, so you can see, and I'm looking at it in a mirror image in the computer screen, but on the left column here, analytic and synthetic, and up at the top, a priori and a posteriori. Okay, so analytic. You see the, I hope you can read it there, all bachelors are male. That's analytic because you just need to analyze the definition of bachelors to know that they're all male. The subject, all bachelors, the predicate is contained in that subject. So it's a priori. You don't need any knowledge, any empirical observations of bachelors. You just need that definition, and it's analytic. So synthetic, and then after experience would be something like dogs walk. So not all dogs walk. It's not necessarily universally true that all dogs walk. Most dogs walk, but I've seen dogs that can't walk. So therefore it fails the tests for pure a priori knowledge, because you can imagine a dog that doesn't walk. So a claim that you can imagine it not being the case cannot be a priori knowledge. And so one of these discussion questions will be having you compare Kant to Hume. Hume would have called this category analytic a priori relations of ideas, and he would have called this category the synthetic a priori, a posteriori, after sense impressions, synthesizing knowledge gained from sense impressions. Hume would have called these matters of fact. So for him, there was only 2 categories of thought: matters of fact and relations of ideas. And for him, relations of ideas are universally true because they're human inventions of the mind. They don't necessarily apply to the material world. And every matter of fact, the opposite of it could also be conceivably true. And Hume said this is where the laws of Newtonian physics, the laws of all physics, they are these matters of fact, and therefore not universal truths, which is what people thought Newton had discovered. The universal truths of God's mind, God's architectonic plan for creating the universe, Newton has discovered them. They are mathematically describable. Hume said, nah, not necessarily. I can imagine the laws of physics described by Newton not working tomorrow, so therefore they can't be necessarily universally true. That is what Hume would say. Now, what Kant is going to bring in is this third category. So, it's called synthetic a priori. And in this category, Kant includes math and physics. So Hume said, math is just relations of ideas. Yeah, of course, it's impossible to imagine 2 plus 2 equaling anything other than 4. Therefore, it is just relations of ideas. I don't see a number 2 anywhere in the real material world. It's just an idea in the mind. So, Kant is going to say, well, you know what? Actually, math is a special thing. Sure, once you discover mathematical truths, you realize they must necessarily be true everywhere in the universe. However, you cannot gain these mathematical truths just by analyzing numbers. You have to have some kind of empirical observations, even if it's only imagining them in your mind. You still have to see objects, which he'll call it an intuition. And his example is 7 plus 5. So, on page 327, he says, in all theoretical sciences of reason, synthetic judgments a priori are contained as principles. So, theoretical sciences of reason. All right, let's just skip down to the bottom paragraph on 327. We might indeed at first suppose that the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a merely analytical proposition following according to the principle of contradiction from the conception of a sum of 7 and 5. But if we regard it more narrowly, we find that our conception of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing more than the uniting of both sums into one number, whereby it cannot at all be cogitated what the single number is which embraces both. So he's saying you can analyze 12 all you want. You're not going to find contained within it necessarily the conceptions of 7 and 5. When you add 7 and 5, 7's one number, 5 is another number. You put them together, now you have another number, another idea. But there's nothing necessarily in the idea of 12 that's going to draw out the numbers 7 and 5 from in your mind. So he'll go on to say, we must go beyond these conceptions and have recourse to an intuition, which corresponds to one of the two. Our 5 fingers, for example, or like Segner in his arithmetic 5 points, and so by degrees add the units contained in the 5 given in the intuition to the conception of 7. First I take the number 7, and for the conception of 5, calling in the aid of the fingers of my hand as objects of intuition, I add the units which I before took together to make up the number. All right, so how do I come to the conclusion that 7 plus 5 equals 12? It won't be simply by using your mind and analyzing the definitions of 7 and 5. You need empirical observations. So you start with the number 7. All right, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now I know I've had an empirical observation. Now I know, oh, 7 plus 5 equals 12. However, once I've made that empirical observation, I realize that must necessarily be true everywhere in the universe. So that should only be true of a priori knowledge. How is it possible that I have come across a universal truth, at least as far as a universal truth about how humans think, yet I gain that knowledge through empirical observations? Hold on one moment. Okay. Sorry about that. I would have paused it, but I've got a 5-year-old girl creating webs of sheets out there. All right, so that for him is the most important category of thought to think about, synthetic a priori, because you can then expand your knowledge of universal truths. And for him, mathematics belongs in that category, and so do what he calls natural philosophy, which is physics, by which he was referring at his time to Isaac Newton's laws of physics. So he's saying Newton did discover infallible universal truths, but they aren't the ideas in God's mind necessarily, but they are the ideas imprinted on the human mind. However, to uncover these categories of thought, these a priori categories of thought, we had to make empirical observations. We had to look at planets through telescopes and use all these mathematical equations, which are themselves a synthesis of empirical observation and this a priori knowledge. So for him, he thought this is going to be the future of philosophy, mapping out these a priori categories of thought. What Plato would have called the ideas, the absolute ideas. So this is, you can see, this is the synthesis of empiricism and rationalism that I started to talk about. If you look on page 328, the paragraph number 2, he numbered them here. It says, the science of natural, it's the last full paragraph. The science of natural philosophy, physics, contains in itself synthetical judgments a priori as principles. So, all right, now I do want to read about another kind of a mental yogic trick of how he comes to the conclusion of what some of these categories are. And his one for space was pretty good, and I'm looking for it. Okay, it is. All right, compelled. There it is on page 323. All right, the last full paragraph above the section 3. So not only in judgments, however, but even in conceptions is an a priori origin manifest. For example, so here's how he's going to show you that space is not out there. It's one of your own categories of thought. He says, for example, if we take away by degrees from our conceptions of a body all that can be referred to mere sensuous experience, color, hardness or softness, weight, even impenetrability, the body will then vanish, but the space which it occupies still remains, and this it is utterly impossible to annihilate in thought. So he's saying, you know, take an object, take this pen. Now take away all the information that you're receiving through your senses, which is the color of it, the shape of it, the feel of it, the weight of it. All right, well then there's nothing there. Yeah, you're right, just empty space. All right, well, eliminate the empty space. What do you have? More empty space. So therefore, you've discovered a category of thought. You can't get rid of it. Your mind, it's forced to think in terms of space. And then he'll go on again. He says, again, if we take away in like manner from our empirical conception of any object, corporeal or incorporeal, so you can imagine a spiritual body, any object, all properties which mere experience has taught us to connect with it, still we cannot think away those through which we cogitate it as substance or adhering to substance, although our conception of substance is more determined than that of an object. Compelled, therefore, by that necessity with which the conception of substance forces itself upon us, we must confess that it has its seat in our faculty of cognition a priori. So substance is another category of thought. We're compelled and forced to think in terms of substance. We're compelled and forced to think in terms of space. Also, we're compelled to think in terms of time. Space and time and the concept of substance are not empirically observable, says Kant. They are, therefore, categories of thought that are forced upon us. We can't not think that way. So what can I know? It's limited by the categories of our own minds. Can we even know what those categories of thought are? Well, that is what he's setting out to do in this critique of pure reason, which he'll also says it's kind of a prelude to what he'll call a transcendental philosophy, and that is also one of the discussion questions. So, in case I forget, and I see it here now, I'm going to mention it on page 331. Section 7, idea and division of a particular science under the name of a critique of pure reason. So he says, from all that has been said, there results the idea of a particular science which may be called the critique of pure reason. For reason is the faculty which furnishes us with the principles of knowledge a priori. There's a good, simple definition of reason. You hear a lot of people say, be reasonable. You know, reason versus religion. What is reasonable? What is reason? Define reason. Well, that is a lot harder to do. And here you see what Kant says. Reason is the faculty, so it's kind of an organ of knowledge, which furnishes us with the principles of knowledge a priori. So reason enables us to understand what these categories of thought through which we think are. Plato would say, reason is the faculty which enables us to perceive the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. And Kant is taking a kind of a compromise position. He's saying, well, whether there's a soul or not, or a God or not, reason can't tell us, but reason can discover for us the lenses of cognition through which humans must perceive the universe. And I'll continue reading here. He says, hence pure reason is the faculty which contains the principles of cognizing anything absolutely a priori. An organon of pure reason would be a compendium of those principles, according to which alone all pure cognitions a priori can be obtained. All right, it's going to get, the language gets more and more complex, but you're getting the basic idea from what I've read so far. If you look on page 332, the middle paragraph, he says, transcendental philosophy is the idea of a science for which the critique of pure reason must sketch the whole plan architectonically, that is, from principles with a full guarantee for the validity and stability of all the parts which enter into the building. It is the system of all the principles of pure reason. That's what transcendental philosophy, the system of the principles of pure reason. And what is reason? Reason is the faculty which furnishes us with the principles of knowledge a priori. So transcendental philosophy is trying to find out what are the categories of thought that are completely separate from empirical observations. What are the structures of the mind itself that transcend the material sense impressions? That's why it's transcendental. So I'll continue to read. He says, if this critique itself does not assume the title of transcendental philosophy, it is only because, to be a complete system, it ought to contain a full analysis of all human knowledge a priori. Our critique must indeed lay before us a complete enumeration of all the radical conceptions which constitute the said pure knowledge, but from the complete analysis of these conceptions themselves, as from a complete investigation of those derived from them, it abstains. So this critique of pure reason is trying to enumerate all the radical conceptions. The radical conceptions seems to me to be another word for these categories of thought. Space is a radical conception. Time. These are the lenses that we're born with and forced to digest our sense impressions through. The transcendental philosophy will analyze further all of these radical conceptions. The critique of pure reason is just trying to say, well, what are these faculties? What are these categories of thought? All right, so going back to these discussion questions on page 335, we've been through discussion question 1 and 2, the distinction between pure and empirical knowledge, and the distinction between analytic and synthetic. And I'll flash this up here again. You can pause this on the YouTube video to try to kind of help you see. Here's how he's categorizing things. For Kant, there's nothing in this category of knowledge. Analytic a posteriori. A posteriori means knowledge gained after sense impressions. Analytic means you don't need sense impressions to gain knowledge of something. You only need to analyze its definition. If the predicate belongs inherently to the subject, then you know it's this a priori. If the predicate does not belong to the subject, then it's something you have gained by synthesizing knowledge after sense impressions, and that would be done in that category. So for Kant, there's nothing here. For Hume, there's nothing there or here. For Kant, this is the area that needs to be analyzed. But transcendental philosophy doesn't deal with this synthetic a priori. Well, actually, transcendental philosophy, it's completely abstains from, all right, let me just read, because now I've got myself confused, and I know that's not going to help you. The bottom of page 332. To the critique of pure reason, therefore, belongs all that constitutes transcendental philosophy. And it is the complete idea of transcendental philosophy, but still not the science itself, because it only proceeds so far with the analysis as is necessary to the power of judging completely of our synthetical knowledge a priori. All right, so the transcendental philosophy does want to deal, and that's why I stopped myself, because this, for Kant, is the most important category to expand upon, and that is what he's trying to gain through this transcendental philosophy. Up at the top of page 333, he says, the principal thing we must attend to in the division of the parts of a science like this is that no conceptions must enter into it which contain aught empirical. In other words, that the knowledge a priori must be completely pure. See, and this is why I'm getting confused, because if it doesn't contain anything empirical, well then, there won't be a synthetic a priori, because synthetic means you've had to have recourse to some kind of empirical observation, like my 5 fingers when I wanted to know that 7 plus 5 equals 12. The bottom of that paragraph on 33 says, transcendental philosophy is consequently a philosophy of the pure and merely speculative reason, for all that is practical so far as it contains, all right. So, it's complicating to me what he's trying to say there, because it seems a little bit contradictory. So, I don't even know if I have this as one of the discussion questions, but, all right, so that was discussion question 5 on page 335. Before I exercise my mind unnecessarily, let me look over here at our exam, and nope, it's not. Good. I probably left that out on purpose because it was confusing me. All right, so I'm not going to belabor that one anymore, and I'm going to go on to discussion question 3. How is Kant's view different from rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz? So the main difference is Descartes, and in the exam I say only look at Descartes' the essays that he wrote from part 1 of our book, discussion question 1, because in the second part of the book he started to question all of his original ideas. So his rationalism was really in part 1 of the book. So the main difference between Kant's views and the rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz is Descartes and Leibniz assume God implanted human souls with these forms of reason. Whereas Kant doesn't want to take that leap of faith. Kant believes in God, but he's saying, can reason guarantee us of that faith? And he doesn't say that it can. So that is one of the main differences. So again, Kant is trying to bridge this empiricism and rationalism. And Leibniz, for example, talks about God's having this pre-established harmony. How do things work in the universe? Well, God organizes everything to interact with everything else. For Leibniz, everything is made out of these monads, which all have perception, and they have zero extension in space. Every monad is kind of like a little soul. But he says, well, we don't want to call them souls if they don't have reason and memory, but even the most basic monad has perceptions, and God orchestrates all of the different monads so that they're perfectly harmonized, and even though each one never has any direct contact with any other one, it seems as if they do, because God is independently organizing them and harmonizing their different activities. And for Descartes, we saw his 2 proofs for that humans are different from animals, and therefore we have a soul because we have reason. Animals can't communicate like we can using symbols. Even though parrots can talk, if you converse with them, they don't know how to respond adequately to a change in conversation. And even though some animals are better at doing certain things like flying or swimming or running, none of them, they fall far short of other activities, whereas humans might not be able to do any particular thing as well as certain animals. We can do everything that all the animals can do because we have reason, which is a universal instrument that serves for all contingencies. So Kant is saying that the a priori categories of thought are not necessarily adequately representing the structure of the universe. You can believe that if the ideas are coming from God's mind and imprinted on your mind, but Kant doesn't make that assumption. So he's just saying, all I can say for sure is that I've got these truths about how the human mind works, not about how the universe works outside of human perception. He's not trying to give you a God's eye view of things. He's trying to give you an analysis of how humans view the world. What are these lenses of cognition? So I will just, now I have here at the bottom of 324. All right, I'm going to just go to this next discussion question. Number 4, how is Kant's view different from the empiricist views of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume? So we didn't read Locke in section 2 of the book, so you can refer to the Locke reading from part 1 where he says, I don't know if there's a soul or not. Probably there is, he says, I believe in the top of page 94. But even if there isn't, we can define the self as consciousness that's conscious of itself. It's consciousness that turns back and reflects on itself, plus any memories you have, or if it's possible, he says, any knowledge of future events that you might do. So, so for Locke, who was an empiricist, knowledge, he did not believe in these innate ideas. Knowledge is coming in from the sense perceptions, and then, but he didn't say a whole lot about, he wasn't focused so much on empiricism in that first part of our book. He was more talking about what is the nature of the self. We skipped Locke in the second part of the book because Berkeley basically summarized the important parts, and that was the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Berkeley says they don't exist. You can't imagine a primary quality. So if you remember Berkeley, he says, what did Locke call a primary quality? Things like extension and movement. Now, secondary quality would be large or small. That's relative to the human perceiver. And motion is a primary quality, but fast or slow is a secondary quality because it's relative to the perceiver. But Berkeley says you can't imagine extension in space without automatically imagining it either large or small. And you can't imagine what motion is without thinking of it as fast or slow. What are you talking about, says Berkeley? The idea of motion in general? Or the idea of length in general? Well, that's just what Plato said, the rationalist. That's idea, that's absurd. What a ridiculous abstraction from reality. There's no absolute idea of motion in God's mind. This material world is God's mind, says Berkeley, and all the physical, so-called physical objects you see are ideas in God's mind. So, and for Hume, he says, okay, all we have is ideas, I'll grant you that, meaning sense perceptions, but I don't see God, so I'm not going to take that extra step. There are only sense perceptions, and then the human mind sees how a certain sequence of sense perceptions occurs regularly, and we assume there's some cause and effect relationship. That means that these sense perceptions must always follow this particular sequence because they're in a causal relationship. You know, this event causes, event A causes event B. Whenever you see event A, you will see subsequently event B because event B and A are connected by this causal principle. Hume said, no, I don't see the causal principle. I see event A, I see event B. You know, I see me eating bread and I see me having nutrition, or I feel me having nutrition, but I don't see what's causing the bread to give me nutrition. And I can imagine me eating bread and getting no nutrition. So therefore, it can't be this universal truth, this necessary truth. It's not a relation of ideas. It's only through an empirical experience that we know bread gives people nutrition. And empirical observations can only ever give us probable knowledge of the future. Most probably, when you eat bread, you'll get filled. But that's not a universal truth. It's not an absolute idea imprinted on God's mind, is what Hume would say. So how is Kant's view different from Berkeley and Hume? So, again, Kant's different from Berkeley because Kant doesn't suppose the existence of God. He says it's natural for the human mind to think about that question. But what is the answer? I don't know. And as far as how he's different from Hume, Kant would say, and specifically with the idea of cause and effect, Kant is going to say cause and effect aren't just arising. The idea of cause isn't something that we just create because we habitually see a certain sequence of events. And he relates it to mathematics, for example. You can't just imagine, and I explained this earlier, that the truths of math. Hume thought you could, and he says they're universally true and necessary because they're complete inventions of the human mind without any necessary relationship to the empirical world. Kant says, no, you have to have this empirical observations to verify the truths of math. But once you've made the empirical observations, you realize they must necessarily be true everywhere in the universe. They're universally true in all situations. So that is not a matter of fact, it's a combination. It's that synthetic a priori that Kant was talking about. And that's how he differentiates himself from Hume. He's saying we do have inborn categories of thought, which Hume rejected. But he's saying they're not necessarily the absolute eternal ideas of God's mind, but they are the categories of thought of the human mind. And we can be certain that the laws of physics will hold true necessarily everywhere in the universe into the infinite future, because you can be certain wherever a human being goes, that human will interpret the incoming sense perceptions in a very specific ordered sequence. Not because of the nature of the outer world coming in, which can't ever be known directly, but because of the nature of the faculty or the a priori categories of thought themselves will always force humans to perceive things in very distinct ways. And that's how he's different from Hume. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I know that that is confusing. I got a little confused myself. If you have questions, put them on the Ask Me, in the discussion forum, the Ask Me, kind of an open discussion forum. And I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can in preparation for the discussion posts on Tuesday. Okay, so for the next video, we skipped William James' Pragmatism, and we are going to go over Alice Crary's essay, A Question of Silence, Feminist Theory and Women's Voices.